Bobby Vinton will not be seen tonight, so that we may bring you the following special presentation.
Well, I had an old beach blanket in my trunk. Wrapped myself up in that for a while. And I'd run my engine about 5 minutes every hour. That's about all I'd dare with the exhaust fumes and everything else. The other night there were a few snowmobiles around, but I couldn't get their attention. And then this morning I tried to walk out, but I just couldn't make it.
The whole house was shaking, and the water started coming in. When I left, there was about a foot of water in the house. I had to get out. I thought the place was going to come down.
I stayed Monday night till about 6:30, and then the oceanside door blew in, and then when I was trying to reinforce that, the picture windows blew in, so I grabbed my kids and I had to run for my life.
The storm sprang at us Monday afternoon, the joint product of a furious coastal low and a giant Arctic high, a nor'easter that defied description. For more than a day, it would pound an inch of snow an hour with winds of hurricane force. By 11 Monday night, traffic had broken down. The city sculpted into a tortured moonscape. And sometime in the small hours, the power went out to 100,000 homes. On Tuesday morning, a winter Atlantis, silent, buried, paralyzed, the faces of the rescuers already lined. The late few travelers tossed this way and that. And still, the snow continued. And with the snow, the wind heaving up gigantic mounds, blowing out windows where it could, pushing our century back and back, leaving us a frozen Sahara. North and south along the coast, discomfort and inconvenience gave way to destruction and tragedy. The wind, gaining strength far out at sea, built an already high tide to a wall of water, smashing through Revere, Winthrop, Scituate, Hull, killing the few, sweeping away homes, displacing 11,000, damage in the hundreds of millions, wiping out past lives in a sweeping flood, threatening the lives of those who live on her, stranding ocean-going ships, washing away our landmarks. But we are not made to buckle to natural forces. When the wind had died and the snow had stopped, recovery was underway already. The first tentative efforts already begun as the storm still raged. The first calls for help already going out. The first responses, quick, in coming in. And as most of us waited for the storm to die, some of us were already fighting back. An effort that would grow from a handful to an all-out assault on the aftermath. This is that story, from those who were there, from the first forecast to the latest situation report, now, at this moment. From the shattered beach towns to the buried highways to the governor's command post. This is our story. We'll be back in a moment. We'll be back in a moment after this along the north and south shores. That is a story that suburban reporter Mike Levitt has been covering ever since it first broke. Mike?
Ted, I think the first thing that's incredible here is on Monday night, when the storm started to reach its peak and the tides were heading for high on the east coast of Massachusetts, no one really had an indication, the officials certainly didn't, that the tides would be as great as they ultimately were. And everyone was going under the assumption that things would happen the way they normally do. The tides would come up 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4 feet above normal, but that would be it, and that you wouldn't have the major damage. Well, obviously, we were to find out that would not be the case. In fact, if we can see what the situation was in Revere, we'll give you an indication.
The combination of factors built those tides, Mike. Harvey will be going into them in greater detail, but it was no doubt that hurricane-force winds and a new moon contributed.
This was the situation in Revere. We got in there first around 8 o'clock. The high tide was to come at 10 o'clock, but 2 hours before high tide, the wall of water had already come over the seawall, so that was giving people the indications of how bad this was going to be. The only way they could evacuate people from these areas were in amphibious ducts. The MDC had 2 of them. They were taken to shelters like the one at Our Lady of Lourdes Church.
The building was surrounded by about between 3 and 4 feet of water.
You heard how it is at this point?
No, I don't. So there's no way I can get back to my home. I came up here to seek shelter. My feet are wet and I wanted to get out of the cold.
Revere Mayor George Colella immediately declared a state of emergency in that city, and it suddenly became apparent that not only was Revere affected, but were many other places. We tried on Tuesday morning to get back to Revere. We went up the Northeast Expressway. First we went to McClellan Highway and couldn't get there. We went back and tried the Northeast Expressway, and here were the ducts, which had broken down the first night and had tried to get back and couldn't make it themselves. Now Revere from the air on that Tuesday after the storm abated. The flooding was still there, people still being evacuated. In Hull on Wednesday morning, which we finally reached after about a 2-hour ride from Boston, we found extensive damage here which really hadn't been reported before. Most people up until that time were concentrating their efforts on Revere. The governor made his flight over the area, and then we were able to show you the 4th successive high tide on Wednesday, the noon high tide on Wednesday, still continuing to buffet these buildings that had been smashed before that. This was the Green Hill section of Hull, where we reported to you live on Wednesday of the extensive damage there, and we showed you what the situation was. The floods, the smashed homes, the situation there.
And the water started coming in. When I left, there was about a foot of water in the house. I went on the front porch and carried a suitcase and my dog. I was up to about my waist.
The oceanside door blew in, and then when I was trying to reinforce that, the picture windows blew in, so I grabbed my kids and I had to run for my life.
The flood tides continued to come in Hull, and by this time people were evacuated in record numbers. 2,000 of the 10,000 residents of the coastal community were in shelters at one of the Hull elementary schools. The high school was out of commission because the flooding had taken its toll there. People got around in boats. They helped out their neighbors, the ones who had stayed in their homes, by trying to bring them food and supplies. The floods were up to 3 feet, but it is important to note that the wall on the bay side held back the water from going possibly 15 feet high as it was 20 years ago. This was the Damon School on Wednesday night with a couple of hundred people there. Senator Ted Kennedy came down to visit the people. He was making a tour of the areas and talked with a couple of local residents about their problems.
The homes.
Oh, I won't leave.
So how are you keeping your spirits up?
Well, what am I going to cry about?
Yeah.
There's no need of crying.
Yeah.
You do the best you can. You pray to God in heaven, that's all. And then I'll leave Hull.
On Thursday, we had a chance to head further south. Knowing the situation in Hull was at least stabilized, the power continuing to come back on, we drove down to Plymouth, and we first encountered the White Horse Beach area. Now, this is an area that is particularly vulnerable to the high tides, and what we found was not only the houses smashed, but seawalls and entire sections of the coast had been washed away underneath these houses. There had been 10 feet of ground under this particular house and a seawall in front of it. This was one of the restaurants in Plymouth, and there was a 2,000-pound rock sitting in the middle of that restaurant. So it gave us some indication of the fury of the sea and just how bad the conditions were.
Mike, you worked that beat in normal times. How did you personally feel going through that devastation?
It was a shocking, it was a helpless feeling when you began to see this destruction. I've been in these areas when they have had flooding. Mm-hmm. I've seen damage from high tides. I've seen dwellings damaged. But I've never seen it like this, and no one in those communities has seen it like this. And I'm just amazed. I want to give a quick credit, if I can, for our photographers, Jimmy Patton and Richie Suskin particularly. We worked in one of our vans for 3 days and got through just about everything. I mean, there were really only a couple of times when we couldn't make it.
Thank you, Mike. On the east was the ocean and the damage it caused. On the west was Route 128. That was Steve Shepard's beat this week.
Ted, the southbound lanes of Route 128, all the way from Route 138 in Canton to Route 9 in Wellesley, came to a grinding halt on Monday evening, the first day of the storm. More than 7 miles of roadway were included in the problem. They were packed with traffic. Cars and trucks, bumper to bumper, three abreast, sat helplessly as the record snow continued to fall, trapping them ever more deeply. In all, more than 2,500 vehicles were entombed by the falling snow, their occupants the hapless victims of two trailer truck jackknifings. The snow was enough to trap some cars on any road in the Massachusetts area, but it was these two jackknifings, the blocking of Route 128 by semi-trailer trucks, that really caused the massive pileup on the southwestern sections of Route 128. Four-wheel drive vehicles, Jeeps with snowplows, everything that got stuck behind those trucks got stuck for good. There was no way out. At first, motorists tried to stick the situation out, but then it became clear they were going to go nowhere, and they decided to leave their cars. The state police on snowshoes and ski mobiles checked occupants of cars and tried to get them away to shelters. For the most part, they were successful. Still, however, Wednesday morning, a few stragglers were being pulled from their vehicles and helped along the way. Remarkably, on Route 128, to our knowledge, no one died, although there were deaths in cars in other adjacent areas. And the reason there were no deaths on 128 was because of fine work by the State Police and National Guard. Very serious cleanup work began Tuesday, but it wasn't until Thursday when units of the 27th Combat Engineering Division came on hand to begin helping Massachusetts State DPW workers clean up 128 that any real progress was made, as bit by bit, car by car, and truck by truck, the vehicles on 128 were pulled from the snowbanks and from the tombs that they had been in. Tractor-trailer trucks were a special problem. Large winches had to be brung in to spring them. Sometimes it took 20 and 30 minutes to get them clear of the roadway. And guardrails on 128 had to be cut down frequently so traffic could be shifted from bare lanes to good lanes. In all, one of the most remarkable things I've seen, today at noon, for the first time in 5 days, Route 128 was open on a limited basis.
Thank you, Steve. Gary Armstrong was everywhere, but his beat was basically the city during this storm. At all hours of the day and night you were out there, Gary, and what did you find?
Ted, the stories that were told by Steve and Mike weren't as bad in Boston. In a way, the storm was like a real-life soap opera. The people of Boston, in this case, were the protagonists. They were trying to deal with a larger-than-life crisis. But like soap operas, the saga of the blizzard of '78 was measured in days.
Day one. The storm built quickly in Boston. Despite the initial forecast and the force of the snow and wind during the first hours, no one was really prepared for what was ahead. The first indication of how bad the storm would be was visual, or rather what was not visual. In Boston, that was just about everything. Visibility in most cases was the length of your arm. In a matter of hours, life ground to a halt in the city. Businesses closed. Cars were abandoned. Pedestrians struggled against swirling snow that whipped around in gusts up to 40 miles an hour in Government Center and other parts of Boston. Halfway through the first day, many people still did not realize the intensity of the storm. Many tried to make their way home despite wanting to remain where they were or to find temporary shelter. Emergency parking bans were affected in Boston, Cambridge, and several other cities and towns in the metropolitan area, as it became apparent that the snow would continue for an undetermined amount of time. By the end of the first day, major streets were completely snowbound. Cars were lost in snowbanks. Secondary roads were obliterated in the wind and fog. Walking through Boston was a hazard because the snow and the sleet ripped and slashed at your face. Day two. The city was completely snowbound. Complicating matters, there had been a widespread power failure during the early morning hours. It left hotels, apartment buildings, and other dwellings in darkness and cut off from communication about the storm's impact. Daybreak of day two. It was obvious that no one was going anywhere. The slow cleanup process began. But even the snowplows had rough going because of the accumulated layers of snow and ice. Abandoned cars were a major problem, but there was little police could do because getting around was equally difficult for them. Most stores were closed. Skeletal staffs were ordered at City Hall and the State House. All other employees were asked to remain at home. Schools were closed. Mass transit was pretty well bogged down, especially on the surface lines. There were still problems with power failures in parts of the city. Most major hotels were over capacity. Several had no heat. Day three, the sun was out, and that alone was moral comfort for many. The city seemed to come partially back to life. There were people on the streets, and since most businesses were still closed, it was an impromptu holiday for many.
I think it's beautiful. I love it.
I love it. It's great.
It's beautiful. I love it.
If most driving was prohibited, and if walking was dangerous, Cross-country skiers had no problems navigating the streets of Boston. Day 3 and Day 4 saw more concern about food and money to buy food. It was a week that brought out the best and worst in Bostonians. To their credit, most people obeyed emergency laws and helped others less fortunate. And as the week ended, even the most tradition-steeped folks admitted that this would be a storm to remember.
Certainly is, Gary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ted.
And on that upbeat note, we're going to end this segment, and we'll be back with more in just a moment. Long after this crisis is over, it will be state of emergency. And Governor Michael Dukakis, who is with me now, first uttered those words declaring a state of emergency shortly before 10 o'clock Monday night, Governor. And from then on, it was fight back against the snowstorm. Now, exactly, first of all, I think a lot of people are wondering what the state of emergency meant, although I'm sure we know by now, but when it will be lifted. Have you any idea on that?
Well, we're progressively lifting it, Ted, from community to community and region to region, and we've come from western Massachusetts east. We now have approximately 43 communities in the metropolitan area. There are about a dozen communities to the southwest of the metropolitan area down toward Rhode Island who have asked to be added to that list, and we will add them. And that's essentially where we are at the present time. Now, I hope, if all goes well by Monday, we can lift it officially, but I want to emphasize that we're going to have some horrendous traffic problems on Monday, and we'll try to put together in the next 24 hours a traffic plan which will deal with what happens when we resume normal activity on Monday.
I think there's a question, at least in my mind, as to whether this current state of emergency in the affected communities extends through midnight Saturday night or midnight Sunday night.
Midnight Sunday night.
You've definitely gone
Yes.
ahead with that then.
Yes.
All right. What has that state of emergency enabled you to do? As we take a look at some of the devastated areas, I want to turn to another matter now, the federal disaster designation. Wednesday, we got our first look at some of the devastation and destruction. We do officially have a disaster designation now, and what's that going to mean to these people?
Well, it means for the coastal communities affected that a whole range of federal aid, loans, grants, and assistance will now come into play, both in a personal sense to help them rebuild their homes and recover their property, in an employment sense, because if they have been unemployed, there will be special aid for them, and for cities and towns and the Commonwealth to the extent that there are public facilities, seawalls, roads, and so on that are going to be rebuilt, and obviously there is much of that in the millions of dollars.
Governor, you've seen a good deal of the state from a different point of view this week. What is your emotional reaction to this kind of devastation, and what does it make you want to do?
Well, when I first looked at that scene down along the coast, Ted, particularly on the South Shore, it wasn't that Revere wasn't bad. Revere was terrible, but Revere, by the time I got up over it, was frozen.
Mm-hmm.
But to see those houses piled like doll houses on their sides, to see houses tipped into the ocean in Holland and Scituate, to see an area in Scituate which I spent weeks in as a kid when I was 3 or 4 up in North Scituate, looking like a pile of kindling, was almost unbelievable. It was really tough to believe that it was happening down below you. The other sense that I had was that those areas were just so terribly vulnerable. Mm-hmm. You don't get that sense when you're on the ground, but when you look down
Thank you
on
very
it,
much, Governor.
it's rough.
I'm most grateful. Well, a storm such as this one gives our meteorologists a chance to test their skills. Harvey Leonard was on duty Friday and Saturday, and as you're about to see, he forecast a major storm brewing.
What's going to happen is a tremendous amount of energy in high levels of the atmosphere pouring down to the southeast will really enhance the development of this storm, and that's the one that we expect to come up the coast in a fashion something like that. With all the cold air that's over us now, unquestionably the bulk of this storm has to be in the form of snow. We think it's going to be a big one of the biggest of the winter. The only way we can see being wrong is if this storm takes a radical turn left, then perhaps some warm air from the ocean would come in. Even if that happens, which I rate a long shot, we'd have to have an extended period of snow first.
That was you on Saturday night, Harvey, and you've been here virtually ever since, forecasting the progress of the storm and giving us the aftermath. What are the chances of the particular combination of circumstances that caused this happening again?
I don't think there's a strong chance, Ted, that we'll ever see anything like that again, or perhaps our families either, because you had not only hurricane-force winds, picture that, without the snow you would have effectively had a hurricane for a while, and then you had a record amount of snow. Sometime in our lives we may see a hurricane during the summer months, and sometime we may see almost as much snow, but together I think the chances are almost impossible.
What about the danger of flooding during a thaw? We now have, I would assume, about 50 inches of snow on the ground in some places, counting the January storm.
In some places. Well, if you remember, that's important. There are two reasons why we might get away in good shape, two reasons to be optimistic. First of all, back on the January storm, when we had almost as much snow on the ground as now, within a week we had a lot of rain, a heavy rainstorm. But because we were able to forecast it ahead of time, many of the storm drains were freed, and there were not too many major problems. The other thing is, think of Buffalo last winter. They had more snow on the ground than we had, and everybody thought they'd have flooding, but the winter broke, they had warm weather with some sun, not too many storms, and the melt was gentle. So that's the thing to hope for, a gentle melt. But our problem is that we're still in a vulnerable storm track and may get more in the way of storminess.
What about the immediate future, Harvey?
The next 3 days will be simple. It'll be cold and dry. There really won't be much in the way of a thaw, but also there's going to be no storms. But we do have to watch something very closely. There is a possibility of an important storm Monday night or Tuesday, just a possibility at this point.
Very briefly, when we talked about this earlier, you said something about a double center to the storm, one near the surface and the other about 18,000 feet up. Could you explain that?
Well, that was the first tip-off. One thing we look for in a real classic case, which that was, we see a pocket of cold air dropping down from high levels in the atmosphere, and that usually triggers off a storm development. This one dropped from the Great Lakes toward the Maryland coast, a storm formed off Georgia, and then the two met, combined off the Jersey coast. We had all of the storms deepening in intensity, and then the storm just sat there for a while. We continue to get it.
Now, I know you only go by what you see, Harvey, but very briefly, if you had a chance to forecast clear and shining or one of these, which would you take?
I'd take clear and shining because of the devastation that occurred, for sure.
Thank you, Harvey. We'll be back with some final notes in just a moment. The fight, she will win the early rounds, and that all our efforts to control our environment must inevitably fall short. We've learned also that society is a pretty recent experiment, that Commonwealth Avenue at 5 a.m. on the morning of a blizzard with a power blackout can be frightening. The molds are broken, the systems are down, titles and offices, wealth and age and color and name are gone. But we've also learned that what we mostly do is help each other out. We went on living quietly and looking in on the neighbor just in case, and standing in line at a store that we walk to on foot and buying an item or two so as to leave something for the next guy and his need. Yesterday, somebody called this station to complain that I was making light of the looting in several parts of Boston. We mentioned it, but we did not dwell on it. The story this time was not the 300, but the 3 million of us who went about our daily lives and looked in on that neighbor and did what we could for ourselves and for our families. I think it was a good moment, and I think that's something to remember. Till the next time, I'm Ted O'Brien. Good evening.